made quite independent of the present government power based on the structural equation. They use a general equilibrium model. And they say that Indian economic growth will be between 6.5 to 6.8% per annum, while the global economy will grow by less than 3% per annum. Now look at the, how does it operate? Yeah, that's right. So this is, I just looked at the past data up to 2014. You said that the red line which is going up, this is at current prices and this is at constant prices. You can see that not only this is an upward moving curve to show that our GDP is increasing, the total GDP is increasing over time, but also the slopes are changing. Up to 1981, the rate of growth was much lower, something less than, sorry, I don't know the percentage, less than 3%. But then you have that picking up during 81 to 91, 91 to 2003-4, and after 2003-4, there's a sharp increase in the growth rate. This is, that was total GDP, this is per capita GDP. Again, you get the same picture, which means that not only our economy is growing, with some annual fluctuation, the rate of growth has increased over time. Now, look at the comparison with the world economy. This is 2002 to 2012. You have the figures. You find this is UK, USA, Eurozone. They are all in a crisis. They are often getting below 0% growth rate. The overall economy is doing so badly, but India and China are much above that. And you see, Indian growth rate, this is the growth rate, right? The y-axis gives us the growth rate and the x-axis gives us the years. You find India and China are the two countries which are keeping the global growth rate above 1%. But India has done relatively worse compared to China. But you might have heard 2011-12 base year revision of the income series. But this is based on 2003-4 as the base year. If you change the base year to 2011-12, you find India's growth rate is similar to that of China. And in fact, the last quarter, India's growth rate is the highest in the world. It's even higher than China, highest in the world among the large countries. So India is doing, despite some annual fluctuations, very well. And look at the share of Asia. In 1700, it was about 58% of the total world income was in Asia. It came down, but the projection is because of India and China doing well, their share is going to be something like 52% by 2050. So there's a very bright future for Indian economy. Indian economy, it would be something like 10% or 11% of the global income now. This is projected to become something like 19 or 20% by 2050. India's share in the population is less than that. So India per capita income at the moment, at purchasing power parity, is about 35% of the global per capita income. And by 2050, Indian per capita income has been projected to be, by global agencies, to be about 20% or 15% higher than the world per capita income. So on the economic front, India is doing reasonably well, is expected to do reasonably well because of the structural factors, our savings rate, our demographic dividend, percentage of young people in the age of 20 to 35 is going to be higher than China and many other countries. So this is the positive development. This is an interesting projection which has been made by Brookings Institute. They try to find out the share of different countries in the global middle class consumption, basically consumption durables. You find China's share at the moment is something like 5% or 6%. This is going to be 18% by 2050. China's share in the global middle class consumption. What about India? India's share currently is less than 5%. But India's share is going to be 28% of the global market because of the emergence of the middle class. In fact, last year when I was teaching in Germany, every time they asked me to deliver a lecture on the emerging middle class of India and how that can help European countries to stabilize their Eurozone crisis. So that's the kind of an expectation. And in fact, projections are that Indian middle class will emerge as a major market for the global situation. Now, what are the implications for urbanization? There are theses given by the radical Marxist colleagues that urbanization is going to be phenomenally high because of destabilization of agriculture, because rural economy is getting eroded, their economic base is getting eroded, and there will be exodus from the rural areas and urban growth rate will be very high. A similar kind of an argument is also coming from the World Bank, saying there is urban avalanche. I'm quoting from the World Bank document. Urban avalanche is going to hit Asia, is going to hit India. Urban growth rate will be so high that we can say epicenter of urbanization, again I'm quoting from the ADB document, epicenter of urbanization is going to shift from Latin America to Asia and to India. There are a large number of such hypotheses, and I think, again, what I said in the beginning, that when you take the hypothesis, you should examine whether they are loaded with empirical facts or they are just emerging out of a definite perspective which is being marketed. You see, when you choose your hypothesis, you should look at the ground reality and then see to it that they don't fall through the gaps. The ground reality should be able to sustain those hypotheses. So I therefore would like to examine these hypotheses with some amount of empirical rigor. Look at the growth rate of urban population. These bars are giving the percentage of urban population in India, which is of course increasing because growth rate of urban population is higher than growth rate of rural population because of migration, because of emergence of new urban centers and also areal expansion. But if you look at the growth rate of urban population, there was some problem during 61, 51, which I made adjustments. But the highest growth rate of urban population we have seen during 71, 81, which was 3.8% per annum. The growth rate of urban population was 3.8% per annum, which came down to 3.1%, and it came down further to 2.7%. It has been maintained at 2.7% per annum, basically because of census activism. Those who have looked at the data, you might have seen that 2011 census records 2,800 new census towns. On an average, no decade has seen more than 500 urban centers coming up. This time it is 2,800, and that's why you find urban growth rate has been maintained. If you assume that only 500 are those which should have come on their own, the growth rate will be 2.5%. It would be showing a decline. So basically, one shouldn't accept this thesis because every newspaper, every policy documents start by saying over-urbanization. India is urbanizing at a rapid pace. We should really look at it carefully because even the UN system, which gives this data, which have started questioning. These blue bars are the growth rates of urban population projected for 2025-30. All these bars are the urban growth rate for the 5-year period 2025-30 given by World Urbanization Prospect, which brings out the data every year, sometimes with a gap. Now, why so many bars? So many growth rates for 2025-30? They are given at different points of time. In 1995, the UN system thought that the growth rate will be 3.3%. Indian urban growth rate
in 2025-30 will be 3.3%. But they realized, UN always revises their calculations based on the national level data which comes up. They revised it downwards, and they have been revising it downwards continuously. They're saying that, sorry, Asian urbanization and Indian urbanization has not come up to the level that we're expecting. Urbanization process has become exclusionary. Large cities have become exclusionary. And that's why they're revising it downwards. Similarly, the growth rate of urban population 2045-50 was also projected earlier to be higher, but now it has been projected to be much less than that. Look at the declining growth rate of urban population, reflecting decline in rural-urban migration. This is for Africa, Latin America. We can understand. Latin American countries on an average have 70 to 85% of the population living in urban areas. We can understand that the growth rate would come down. Africa, partly because of poverty, also because of the medical HIV/AIDS problems, which has really increased the death rate. But Asia also reporting a decline in the rural-urban migration and urbanization at a low level of urbanization is something that needs to be examined. Now, this is the projected urban population for Asia. This is the projection given for 2005. This was 2,700 million, but they have revised it downwards in 2009 to 2,300 million. So evidently you find that for whole of Asia, the urban population projection made now is much less than what was done earlier, and similarly the growth rates have been revised downwards for Asia. These are the figures for India. The percentage of projected urban population in 2020 was 41.3%. That was the projection made in 1996, but now in 2010 it has made at 37.5, and if I'm not wrong, I just saw the latest one, it is showing somewhere around between 3.6.5 to 3.7%. Similarly, the growth rates have also been revised downwards. So there is a general agreement that our cities are not absorbing the migrants, particularly the large cities have certainly become exclusionary because they are creating space for the global capital, for the national capital, and as a result, migration of the poor in the large cities have become less. Mumbai's growth rate in the central areas is negative. Delhi's growth rate has become half during 2001, 2011 compared to 91, 2001. So basically I looked at, this is a paper which has come in EPW, myself and Lopamudra Saraswati, which we looked at what kind of migrants are coming in. Are the poorest of the poor coming into the urban areas? You find cities have become, in a way, labor market has become somewhat hostile, if I can say that. And you do find, I divide the migrants into 4 parts and also non-migrants into 4 categories, 4 quartiles. And you find that in the lowest quartile, the migrants per capita expenditure is higher than the non-migrants. Same for the second quartile, say third quartile, same. Fourth quartile, same, which really means that the migrants are much better off compared to the non-migrants. Migrants being defined the way census does and NSS does, that is 3 months of stay. Obviously, most of us would be migrants in the place where we are enumerated, and this gap has gone up. Basically, we are saying that the migration composition has changed over time. It is somewhat better off, more skilled, more educated people who are able to make it to the urban areas, and that is what is making our urban structure exclusionary. Look at the structure of urban population into 6 size categories. Class 1 cities had only 26% of the population, of the total urban population in Class 1 cities. Class 1 cities means having population of 100,000, but this has gone up to over 70%. So our urban structure has become top heavy. This is a graph I am very fond of showing, and some of you might have seen before. This is giving us the percentage of population in cities with population over 5 million. So in the numerator, you have population of all the cities having population of over 5 million. In the denominator, we have total urban population. And we find that Europe has 7.5, Africa 9%, less developed countries 15%, world average is 15.5, developed countries 16%, Asia 18%, South Central Asia, which has India and China, has 23%, and India has 23.5%. Basically, our urban structure is top heavy, and the moment you find that the large cities are trying to attract global capital and they are becoming exclusionary, obviously the overall growth rate of urban population would go down. I took 26 of the largest cities, even with the aerial expansion that has taken place, excepting Bengaluru and Puducherry, you find all these cities are showing a decline in their growth rate of population during 2001 and 11, after adjusting for even decline in the fertility. You know, urban fertility has also gone down, natural growth rate has gone down, but still you find that the decline in the growth rate of the large cities is much more than what can be explained in terms of fertility decline. Now, what is the implication of this urban decline for the projection that Brookings Institute has made? The moment you assume that the urban growth rate will not increase, it will remain at the same level as 2001 and 11, you find your area which was projected becomes less, which means that Indian growth rate which has been projected, if the urban growth rate does not go up, what kind of urbanization, large cities vis-a-vis small towns, we'll discuss that later, but this is a very significant point, that unless your urbanization becomes inclusive, you find that overall migration of the rural population to the urban areas would become less, unless the large cities become inclusive, or unless there are a large number of small and medium towns which can come up. If they come up, unfortunately they have not happened excepting in 2011 census, and they have not been given the status of an urban center. Mr. Venkaiah Naidu always has 4,041 urban centers. Whenever he talks of urbanization, he talks about 4,041, excluding another 3,000 census towns which are showing the potentialities of growth or at least some amount of dynamism, but they have not been covered under any program. In fact, I was attending a meeting in the Ministry of Rural Development last week, and they said Shyama Prasad Mukherjee program of rurbanization would give some amenities to these census towns, and really the approach seems to be very, very unsatisfactory. Okay, so this is the second provocation that I wanted to leave with you. The third one is about sustainability and environmental concerns pertaining to goal 11 of the SDG, which has been approved in the last month in the World Summit. Now, you see, look at the emissions part. This is a major pressure coming on India. India has been, in a way, forced to bring out what's it called, indicative, nationally determined contributions, right? It is no longer Kyoto Protocol restricted the emission curve only on the Annexure 1 countries. Only the developed countries were asked to comply with the emission standards, but now the pressure is that all the countries must submit their indicative, nationally determined contributions of bringing down your emissions to be discussed at the global platform in Paris. China has already mentioned that by 1930, the total emission of India will go, of China will go down. India hasn't yet mentioned that when the total emission will start going down. It has mentioned that by 2030, our energy intensity will go down by 33 to 35%, which means that per capita, out of per capita GDP, the energy content will go down, which means total, if your income is growing at a faster rate, your total emissions can still go up. So now, look at the present situation. You do find that USA has roughly 20 tons of carbon per capita as the emission. This is China. China's figure is presently about 5.2, 5.3 tons per capita, but the rate of growth is something like 4% per annum. USA and Russia are having higher level, and USA is showing a stabilization or decline, but certainly Russia is still showing increase. Japan is showing an increase. Germany in the European countries is showing significant decline, but India's per capita emission of carbon is much less compared to even China, and the global level will be more than 10 tons per capita. But India's level is low, but growth rate is something like 3.2% per annum, which has been a subject of discussion at the global level. You know, when I taught research methodology courses, I always said what is in the denominator is very important. You have number of hospitals. You divide by the number of persons in the district or area, or number of villages. So I thought the choice of the denominator is very interesting, are important. In Germany, whenever I was invited to give a talk on this, I said, why do you take in the denominator the total emission divided by 24 hours? In 1 hour, how much India is emitting? Why don't you divide by population? He said, no, after all, the contribution is coming in the country. India is a country where many of the districts are larger than the European countries. But nonetheless, having said that, let us be realistic. The normative position that we have taken, India is taking, China, Brazil, all the emerging economies do tend to take, that our current emissions, as long as it is much less than the global average, we should be allowed to pursue our Millennium Development Goals pertaining to poverty eradication, education, health, because these are also part of SDGs. In the Sustainable Development Goal, first 7 are more or less carryover from the MDGs. So if you really try to bring a cap on the total emission, it might conflict with the MDG of poverty reduction. But nonetheless, the global emissions, we say that historically we are not responsible. We have contributed only 2% of the total greenhouse gases which is in the atmosphere. So we should be, it is the developed countries who are responsible for it, and they should take the total responsibility of meeting the problems of climate change. I must tell you, in the global platform, this kind of an argument doesn't have much weight. The power structure, the global architecture is very, very different. I remember I made a presentation in a couple of German universities when I was there. They would say, look, what our forefathers did, we are not responsible for that. Also, before 50, 60, 70 years, nobody knew about climate change. How can you hold our forefathers responsible for the climate change problems when they didn't even know about it? So I have a feeling that this strongly normative position which the earlier government has taken, and thankfully the present government is also pursuing, that common but differentiated responsibility. India has a role because India is the third largest emitter in terms of total emission. India has to shoulder the responsibility, but nonetheless, as I said, there has to be also some period allowed for following the other Millennium Development Goals of poverty eradication. I did a paper quickly reviewing the global negotiations, the Kyoto Protocol and the Doha Declaration, which carried forward the restrictions for only the Annexure 1 countries, the developed countries, and there has been limited success because these protocols did not have the teeth, they are not mandatory, but more importantly, they only cover 35% of the total emission, Kyoto Protocol. And Doha Declaration, which really extended it by another 5 years, covered even less. Now, requirement is, and the pressure is, that the whole world, all the countries must submit their indicative, nationally determined contributions, right? That is a must, and which is coming, every country is submitting to the Paris conference, that every country has to take the responsibility, and I have a feeling that India has got to accept this. But the challenge is not only to reduce your emissions by 40%. That is very much achievable. In fact, India's promise that renewable energy will come up and we'll create a carbon sink for 2 to 3.5 billion tons of carbon itself will reduce our carbon intensity by 35%. It is very much achievable. But let us look at a rough projection. In order to keep the global temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, which itself is not free from problems. In fact, the SDG declaration, Sustainable Goal Declaration, have also envisaged 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is more desirable. If you have 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2100, then the countries which have a coastal area and the island countries will have serious problems. But even if we accept, we have to bring down the current resource consumption to half. And the projection is by 2060, our global income will be 4 times. That means your energy efficiency has to be 8 times. If you have to bring down your current energy consumption to half with the present level of income, if your global income is 4 times and you have to still bring it down to half of the earlier resource use, your resource efficiency has to be 8 times. That's why my submission is we have to think of not adaptation strategies, mitigation strategies. We have to think of resilience. We have to think of creating an urban structure, a special structure of development which can really change the lifestyle. The American president always said that American lifestyle is not negotiable at the global tables. But I have a feeling that with the growing pressure which will come in, and if India can also say, not as a matter of mandatory requirement, but as its indicative strategy saying that yes, we would be able to bring it down by 35%, the carbon intensity, that would itself help in building a global pressure. But the requirement is your 40% of the total energy. This is the commitment that India has already made. 40% of the total energy will come from, renewable sources, non-fossil fuel sources. That would certainly affect the pattern of urbanization. Forestry to go up to absorb 2 to 3.5 billion tons of carbon would also mean a different kind of urbanization. Look at the 12th five-year plan document. It talks about distributed urbanization. It says urbanization is going down, but we have to have little more balanced urbanization. And in fact, there are HUDCO, Housing and Urban Development Corporation figures. The energy requirement, cost of bringing water in the large cities, as I mentioned that our urban structure is very much in favor of the large cities, that would be much higher than if you have a distributed urbanization. This has been accepted generally that if you have small and medium towns coming up in terms of energy consumption, in terms of emission, they would help us in really bringing a paradigm shift in energy consumption, and not reduced by 35-40%, but it would mean substantial contribution, which is expected from this country. And I have a feeling that pattern of urbanization is something that we should be debating. That brings me to the last point, and I'll take another 5 minutes just to conclude this. The question is, whenever we say that let's have a balanced urbanization, especially distributed urbanization, even though the present government has talked about smart cities, it has never said distributed urbanization model is not accepted. Is it possible that the smart cities can promote a large number of regionally linked townships which can absorb the surplus people from the rural areas? The rural income growth is much less. With all the technological possibilities, rural income, Indira Bani is here. I hope she doesn't have other figures. We had a discussion before about a year when Montek Singh Ahluwalia was present with a large number of others. He said agriculture possibility is not more than 3% long term, but overall economic growth rate will be 6.5%. So you have to shift people from agriculture to non-agricultural activities, and we need that kind of a dispersed urbanization. I'll give you a quick calculation. Our total population is 130 million. With all these population growth control measures, our total population by 2050 will be 1,600 million. Number of workers currently is about 500 million. This will become 910 million. We will have additional 410 million people asking for jobs. Although our population will grow by less than 400 million, our workforce will increase by more than 400 million because of the demographic dividend. The children are already there, they are entering labor force. You cannot absorb them in agriculture without bringing down the rural income. You have to have non-agricultural activities, and if the big cities are becoming exclusionary, there has to be an alternate paradigm of urbanization. The last question that I would like to put before you is a study. Before that, let me give you an interesting exercise that I did. Can we tell the developed countries that, look, you bring down your energy consumption? They would say, why our lifestyle is not to be negotiated. But this is an interesting exercise that I did when I was teaching at Würzburg. What I did, I divided the countries into three categories. One is those countries which have less than 1,000 kilo oil equivalent. The second category is those who have between 1,000 KOE to 3,000 KOE, and the third category which consume more than 3,000 KOE. I put them into three categories and I fitted regression lines, and you can clearly see that for the less developed countries, the relationship between emission, energy consumption, and growth in income is positive. That means if you have growth in income, your emissions will go up, your energy consumption will go up. In the second level, again, the relationship is positive, but it is not that strong. Whereas for the countries which are consuming above 3,000 kilo oil equivalent, their relationship is absolutely not positive. I just wanted to show this graph. You took the population weightages. This is the consumption. This is CO2 emission, and this is the Human Development Index. I changed it to income also. I played with large number of indicators. What you find that the relationship is not negative. Sorry, is not a linear one. Up to this level, this is 1,000 kilo oil equivalent. The relationship is positive, but the middle level, the relationship is positive, but not that strong. Whereas at the highest level, with 92 countries, the relationship between CO2 emissions and human development is not positive, which really, this is an argument which we can give it to them that, look, you are not benefiting in terms of either income growth, nor in terms of human development, if you just go in for this kind of energy consumption and emission of greenhouse gases. Just, sorry, this, I take just one more minute. What I wanted to ask myself is that, is it possible really to have manufacturing production in small and medium towns, in the rural areas? Is there demand for it? Or do we have to produce them and bring it again to sell? If the Shama Prasad Mukherjee scheme, I told the secretary, if it means producing doormats and napkins and large number of machines are given, that doesn't have a market. You have to link them up with the regional market, with the national market, with the global market. And is there a demand for it? What I did, I looked at the data for 2009-10, consumption expenditure data, and I tried to find out the middle class. Middle class being defined as those, this is defined by McKinsey Global Institute. I took their standard definition. Also, Abhijit Banerjee has done a lot of work on middle class. Brookings Institute has also done this work on middle class. So those who are getting $10 to $50, that is the middle class. And I found, as I said, the projection of Brookings Institute is that 28% of the total middle class demand will be in India by 2050. How much of that middle class demand is coming from metropolitan cities? How much is coming from the smaller towns? How much is coming from the rural areas? This is an interesting question. Is this middle class demand, which is refrigerators, cars, motorcycles, washing machines, furnitures, where is this demand coming from? And my hunch was that 80% or 90% of that demand of consumer durables is coming from the million plus cities. I looked at the NSS data and I was really surprised that only 35% of this demand is from million plus cities, 30% is from smaller towns, and another 30% is from the rural areas. I was surprised. I said, how come there is a demand? Isn't it that cars are much more in the big cities, washing machines are more in the big cities? Yes, they are there, but NSS gives you consumption within a year. Our demand for car and washing machine have been met for many of us before 10 years, 15 years. The new demand is coming in the rural areas, in the small and medium towns. I just wanted to show you this. These are the projections given by different research institutions about the projected middle class. The present middle class for India, it is very low at the moment, as I mentioned. But look at the projection that has been made for 2030. All the projection, income tax data, if you take NSSO data, McKinsey Global Institute, Brookings Institute, NCAR, all of them are saying that by 2030, the middle class will be something like 60% or 40 to 60%. And look at the consumption pattern. In the metro cities, of course, as I said, 35% of the demand is from metro cities, but much of the expenditure in the metro cities are on fuel and light. On this side, this is the demand for the metro cities. They are spending on transport, they are spending on beverages, rent and other services, dental services, educational services. But as far as the rural areas and other urbans are concerned, the medical expenditure and consumer durable assets is much higher in terms of per capita expenditure. So basically, I'm putting this question that perhaps if middle class is emerging, which is a reality, it is not going to be restricted to the million plus cities. There will be consumption demand in the smaller towns and in the rural areas. If your Make in India plan can take the production base into the rural areas, into some cluster kind of a development, I have a feeling your urbanization scenario would also change, and we might be able to really promote sustainable development in the country. Sorry, I took more than I thought I would. Thank you.
So now the floor is open for the dialogue with Professor Kundu. I want to ask you, before I hand over the mic to the students, one provocative question. The recent World Bank document about urbanization in India states that the current level of urbanization in India is 52%. And there has been this talk ongoing about that India's real urbanization is much higher than what has been projected in the census. What is the real situation? How do you look at the two statistics?
Thank you. You see, there are two reports. Okay. One which has been released, I don't know whether you have seen it before, 2 months. The title is Messy Urbanization in Asia. And when we have been, some of us have been all along saying that urbanization rate is not picking up and migration rate is much less than what has been projected. Still, the World Bank gave a thesis of hyper-urbanization and epicenter of urbanization is shifting. But this document, for the first time, admits that the migration rate has gone down. This you can just download. It says that Indian urbanization is very messy. It is taking place in small and medium towns. In situ urbanization, people are not moving in. The migration rate has gone down, but nonetheless, it is not really responding in the manner urbanization as it should have. So basically, they are saying urbanization needs to be perhaps strengthened. And my proposition is that given the exclusionary trend of the large cities, and there is elite capture through the market, through resident welfare associations and all that, I have a feeling to make the large cities inclusive is possible to a limited extent. You have to think of more dispersed urbanization. But Darshini, the question is very valid. I mean, I think it is 2009, in the World Development Report had given a figure of Indian urban percentage to be 52% and China's urbanization to be 48%. Whereas, I mean, official figures which is published in the bank is that India's is 31% as given by the census and China's is something like 44, 45%. Now, how did it happen? What they did an interesting methodology. They, instead of going by the census data collection, the institutional mechanism of data collection, they went for a technological mission. They used GIS data, and whenever they found there's a contiguity of settlements, they said this is urban. They started with the large cities, and around that, whatever contiguous settlements are there, they've multiplied by the density to find this out. Now, I would think that urbanization is not just a phenomena of contiguity and density. We have been taking historical, institutional factors into consideration. But the other problem that many people have raised, Darshini, Partho specifically is one, who says that Indian urban definition is much more stringent
that is another
than the global definition.
Even
India,
is making
India says that census urban centers is those who have more than 5,000 population. 75% of the workforce should be outside primary, sometimes outside agriculture, and density of population. They say density and population size is all right, but workforce being outside agriculture, 75% is a too stringent thing. Now, how do you answer that question? One thing is that if it is stringent, and if you relax it, your percentage of urban population will go up, but urban growth rate will not go up, because you have to apply the same definition even earlier. So your growth rate will not get affected. Second, World Urbanization Prospect gives the definitions of all the countries in one appendix. You can check that. That's the only way that I don't have an access to a world level research study. I looked at the definitions which have been given for different countries. Do you know in Netherlands, what is the size? 20,000 population. And there are countries in Middle East where urban centers are defined. They will not increase over time. So I looked at these definitions and I found that about 55% of the countries are having less stringent definition, but 45% of the countries have more stringent definition. So I'm not really convinced that the Indian data system is very, very unrepresentative. And even if you say that, no, let us bring it down from 75% of workers to be outside agriculture to 50%, your one-time increase will be there in urban population, but growth rate of urban population will be less, as we have found by different sources. And it is not that the migration data itself shows that there is slight decline from NSS data shows that. Even urbanization rate itself, if you adjust for the definition, you do find there is somewhat a decline in the growth rate. Should we take down the questions and then?
Yeah, I think now we can take, you want a paper?
I'm Kannik Bayadi. I'm a student from Faculty of Technology, an undergraduate. And my question is basically, how much do you think is the contribution of this slow growth rate? How much do you think is affected by the hostile nature of construction labor in cities around India? And would it be fair to say that better working conditions or better labor laws in urban areas would lead to a higher urbanization rate over time?
Other questions?
Would you mind if I take some other questions together?
So you said that the dispersed urbanization is the key now, and the cluster-based industrialization should take place for the meeting consumption of rural area. We have seen that this clusterization and small medium industrialization, which is coming up with the MSCs, is urging the rural labor market, employing large number of people from rural area. So one thing is that, and those industrialization are of polluting in nature. So isn't it that we are shifting the pollution from the large cities towards the rural hinterland by way of reallocating those industries to the rural area. And thereby, again, pollution indications will be, and the rural area, there's a less check and balance as far as the people's awareness is concerned, pollution. That's what the feeling is all about. And CPCB report also says that the unaccounted pollutions are much more in rural areas. So isn't it, in the long run, would be not very beneficial as far as sustainability of urbanization is concerned? Thank you.
Yeah, my question is how reliable are the migration data from the NSS? Because, you know, if you try to estimate, different estimates are given, a range of estimates are very high, 120 to 150 million seasonal migrations taking place in India. That's what experts argue. And that's why what I feel is that the migration is much more perhaps than what is indicated by NSSO. And that's one of the reasons. This is seasonal migration, they go back, and that's why it's not really diversifying the economy in terms of employment as it should do otherwise. Many countries where migration has happened like that, like Brazil and China, diversification of employment has taken much faster. But our case, it's not that fast because of this characteristic of the seasonal migration, people going back.
Yes, at the back. Questions? This is a dialogue with Professor Kundu.
My question is more related to the kind of subaltern urbanization or unacknowledged urbanization that we have been speaking about. Some studies on at least the state of West Bengal has shown that it's not more led by industry, and it's more of a agriculture-based non-farm employment which is leading to growth of these small urban centers. Does that mean that we need to rethink urbanization in the sense of the nature of urbanization itself, and yes, relaxing some of those criteria based on which we really identify urban centers, and would that be more sustainable kind of a growth?
We can take this set and then...
You can answer this. And
Now first is that construction sector which has grown in terms of its contribution in income,
national income, and also the labor force. I mean, construction sector is one which has done reasonably well. And 2 days ago, I was talking about the housing sector, and I did say that massive boost that has come to the construction comes from housing, and housing not for economically weaker section or low-income group, where our committee, Darshini was a prominent member, we had said that 92% of this housing shortage is for the poor and LIG people. But actual construction has taken not for them, not even for MIG. Do you know highest growth rate of housing is for whom? It is for vacant houses. The percentage of vacant houses have gone up. This is all, you know, if the government subsidy to the construction sector and housing sector is for speculative housing, then it's certainly not a social purpose. Even if middle class is getting it, I mean, I think such a huge subsidy which is being thought about as a part of Prime Minister's 2022 Housing for All program, I mean, massive subsidy should go to the targeted section. But nonetheless, answering your question, construction sector was not that bad even in the 70s and the 80s. There could be undercount of the construction workers. I entirely agree. You know, I was a member of National Statistical Commission, and I shared this. I think, Indira, you were also there for some time. I shared this concern about the migration data, and we had 2-3 meetings involving the civil society organizations, the representatives who work at the ground level. And all that we did was to say, okay, let us define migrants as those who have either shifted their place of residence by 3 months. If you are living at a place for 3 months, you are identified as a migrant. Or even if you have come here for a month only, but you say, yes, you are going to stay here for 3 months for education. Suppose somebody has just come, he said, but I am certainly staying here for more than 3 months. The person is a migrant. Those who have gone back, we are capturing them through seasonal migration. We are saying that, did you travel somewhere else and came back within 3 months period? If people do not report that, because of some inhibition, I don't know how we can capture that. If the gender violence in India is not reported, is underreported, if the households do not come up and mention that, and 90% of the gender violence is within the household or within the locality, census can't do very much about it. But what I am simply arguing is that the character of this migration and the seasonal migration, I'm putting them into two categories, their changes that we are seeing in that is very significant. It is showing exclusionary urbanization. You do find that the percentage of poor in Delhi was something like 53% by NSS data of 72-73. Now it is less than 10%. 9% is the percentage of poor below. And take all the metropolitan cities together, percentage of poor is much less compared to what we had before. It's 12 or 13% if you take all the metro cities together. Other urban centers have 29, 28% by Tendulkar's formula. So basically, Indiraji, I think we have to accept that the character of migration is changing. The real dispossessed, illiterate, uneducated person are not able to migrate from the rural areas because labor market in the urban areas is very different. There are safety, security concerns. There is one murder or one theft, and in a rich area, 20 households are thrown back. There are police verification forms to be signed. There are now domestic helps have to be routed through some companies. They charge a lot. They are making things expensive for the poor migrants to come in. And therefore, when I look at the character of the seasonal and the long duration migrants, this thesis that the migration process is becoming exclusionary is being validated. Also, there's another interesting information from census. They ask this question, what is the duration of your stay? Nobody wants to say, I have been here only for a year, because you know that you might be thrown out by the state policies or by the local hostility. They always say we have come before 10 years. And that mismatch can be shown clearly now from the data. So people are claiming, yes, they have come here, but the duration they are certainly wrongly stating. But there are problems, I agree, in capturing the construction laborer. But I would think that there is also a column on migratory workers. Are you commuting? Commutation data is also available from National Sample Survey, which shows some increase. But the fact that the large cities are not allowing the informal activities to the extent it was possible. Somebody could come from the rural areas and to occupy some place and start polishing shoes on the roadside. That has become much more difficult because of the law and order problem, health hygiene problem. You always find that the poor localities get targeted. And I would like to mention in this context, what is this slum population in India? 2001 census. And there is not much possibility of slum population being underreported. Definitions have more or less remained the same. 63 million people lived in slum areas. And Pranav Sen committee projected that the slum population in 2011 will be 93 million. And what happened? 2011 census said that the slum population has gone up from 63 million to 65 million. Percentage of slum population has gone down. All that data put together, gives me clear indication that the cities are not welcoming. It is really trying to attract the global capital. This is a middle class capture. Resident welfare associations are become very, very active, and they would not like earlier in the 70s, look at the public interest litigations. They were all trying to protect the slum dwellers and the poor in an unauthorized manner. Now most of the public interest litigations are for cleaning up the parks, cleaning up the middle class areas. So this is something that I would like to submit for your consideration, although I don't want to put that as a very strong, empirically rigorous argument. Yes, rural-urban linkages. As I mentioned, 2 days ago, I was attending a meeting in the Ministry of Rural Development on Shama Prasad Mukherjee scheme, and I said, if in the name of cluster development you only promote, give sewing machines and ask them to make some architectural stuff, you would have to pick them out and sell them. This is not going to help in rural development. I was really surprised, even in the 12th plan document, they said the rural areas must, will get their supply from the nearby urban areas, and urban areas will get their milk and vegetable from the nearby rural areas. This is absolutely nonsense. Vegetables, fruits, milk, they're all coming from a national market. The milk that comes to many of the towns in, even in Madhya Pradesh and UP are coming from the national or the regional grid. I mean, Amitabh Bhaviskar was saying that go to the rural area, you find kurkure and the potato chips all being produced by the national market. To think that the villagers will get supply from the nearby urban areas is no longer correct. So these clusters should really help in getting linkages with the at least the regional market, state level market. Otherwise, if you think that you will produce and sell them within the community, this is not a model of rural development. And I do feel that there is a possibility of this Making India plan, if you really take them to these clusters and see to it that what can effectively be produced in those clusters, then that would be a great thing. I was doing a field survey last month in Kerala, and would you believe percentage of manufacturing employment in rural Kerala is higher than in urban areas? There are industries in the rural settlements and they have come up. The rural-urban distinction is less. I mean, Kerala has a unique geography, but nonetheless, I think if you provide transport connectivity and infrastructure, which should be the priority of the government, it should be possible to disperse your economic base. Migration percentage, as I said, is roughly in the 30% in the urban areas, which is, I think it is on the lower side, but we have tried to correct the data in all possible ways. I remember with Sainath, I had an argument in Shimla and also in Mussoorie. He said, I cannot believe this data, NSS data, that migration percentage is so low. Because in my village, earlier there are only 3 buses coming. Now there are 17 buses coming to Chennai. Sainath, you have heard of him. So one of our students, maybe you remember Shekhar Vidyarthi, he stood up and said, sir, how do you suggest that NSS should measure migration? Should we take the number of buses and multiply it by some 30 and find out the migrants? What else do you do about this? I share the anxieties about the reliability of the data. I think we are making efforts to see that the short-term migration do get captured in the best possible manner.
At the back.
Hello.
Sir, my question is in relation to the role of governance, or basically the lack of governance. We just talked about that there has to be a decentralized model of urbanization need to be practiced, and small and medium towns had to come up and take the share of the rural population in the workforce participation. But the idea is, do these the small towns have the capacity to actually promote the industrialization or industrial clusters as a whole, and and many of the urban settlements have, as you have highlighted, are go in the form of the census towns that even lack a statutory body forming the regulations. So how can we account for this gap between of lack of governance? Because it is very necessary. So if you have any points to highlight on this.
I'd like to respond, otherwise some questions may get left out. You see, even without the governmental support for the large villages to attract industries by providing infrastructure, you do find that 2011 census reports a large number of census towns. Census towns are those which are not recognized by the state government as urban. The urban development department does not give them any funding because they are not within their jurisdiction, and they have all come up automatically. Their percentage of workforce has gone above 70% outside agriculture. You were talking about West Bengal. West Bengal is the state which has reported largest number of new towns in 2011. Do you know what is the second state which has the largest number? Kerala. Kerala's percentage of urban population in one decade has gone up from 25% to 48% because of these new towns coming up. Now, I was asking this question, that how these centers have come up to certain extent they are linked with the neighboring urban areas or in corridor. There is an interesting paper by Mahalaya Chatterjee on West Bengal's urbanization during 2001-11. She shows that 40 to 45% of the urban centers you can explain the new census towns have emerged because there is some linkage. But there are other towns which have come up where there is no economic rationale. It could be just the push factor from the rural areas which have sent people to come to these large villages. I have all along argued that if in the 11th plan we had a JNNURM, 65 big cities have massive amount of money. Now under Amrut and under smart cities we have 98,000 crores, which is equivalent to 1 trillion rupees. Housing for all will have 3 trillion rupees. I think if you can put that money in a manner that you can create clusters, provide infrastructure, housing would be one of them, it is possible to really have this distributed model of urbanization. Again, I'm saying this is a question that I'm putting forward to the government, that should we really go in for this kind of a large city-based urbanization? You have heard of McKinsey Global Institute's projection. They have said by 2030, there will be 65 million plus cities. And the high-powered committee, which was headed by Isha Aluwalia, had said, no, not 65 million plus cities. There will be 87 million plus cities. I mean, should we really have this kind of a top-heavy urbanization while we find that the big cities are becoming exclusionary? Should we really support them with massive infrastructure and then see that they stand up? Or should we see that there are small and medium towns linked with the large cities which come in the hinterland? Delhi-Mumbai corridor is proposed to have 8 million plus cities. There is no plan. In fact, Ejaz Ghani has studied that. It shows that if there is a number of small and medium towns which can get connected with this corridor, there will be much more balanced development. This is a hypothesis I'm putting forward. The cost calculations will have to be taken up. Cost of providing drinking water, electricity is much higher in the larger cities. You go up vertically, that cost can be brought down, which will also help in environmental, protection and climate change implications.
The question he had put was that do these towns have governance capacity and absorb the amount of investments that is being talked about?
I think this is an important issue, and that's why we said that, I'm sorry, I didn't elaborate that. When we suggested that there should be another mission like JNNURM, which will cover these small and medium towns, strengthen their governance. And I think this was a question asked by Anil, that would they have the capability to protect environmentally, because you can, in the big cities, there is an awareness in the middle class about environmental problems, but in the smaller towns, you can perhaps ask a ask a sarpanch, perhaps can bribe them. No, bribery is not only confined to the rural areas, that at the higher level, but a sarpanch may think that genuinely if I get 20 crore of rupees, it will do good for my village. And he might give that land without knowing the environmental implication. So I entirely agree that if you really want to promote a dispersed kind of an urbanization, you need a mission which would strengthen their government, strengthen the infrastructure. It needs an alternate kind of a paradigm of development, which to my mind is feasible, provided there is a political will.
If we see the Gini coefficient or the Z value, that from 2001 it was 0.54 according to the census data, and Gini, which I have calculated, and in 2011 it gone to 0.68 if we see the class wise. So it shows the more concentration of population of urban population in the larger cities, whereas if I have seen the Gini according to the states. So in 2001 it was 0.0089, and in 2011 it was 0.0003. So it has a decline. It shows that the more dispersed urban population is in the state-wise. So still we can go for decentralization of the urban centers. We should not go for the concentration of the so high level. So that because it will lead to more problems such as having a need for more infrastructure and creating a lot of problems environment point of view as well as there are many problems.
No, I think you asked me the most difficult question. I have to sit with your data sheet and look at that. You know, what you are saying is that you take the population across different size classes and then calculate the inequality in the distribution, and you find that at the national level there is an increase, but at the state level there is the opposite trend coming out.
Yes, sir.
And this is something that we have to check. But I'll tell you something that I did long time back. If you look at the growth rate of class 1 cities, 81, 91, 91, 2001. Growth rate of class 1 cities after excluding the new towns which graduate into class 1 category. You know what happens? Class 2 becomes class 1. And if you take that, the growth rate becomes very high. So you take only those towns which belong to class 1 category in the base year and only take their population. If you do that, you do find class 1 cities have a higher growth rate compared to class 2, class 3, class 4, class 5. Class 6 towns again have very high growth rate because class 6 towns are generally those which are created by government intervention, some university town or some railway state town or then special characteristics. And the growth rate is higher and then more stable. Whereas class 2, class 3, class 4 town average growth rate is slightly less and is much greater instability across the size class of town, which means some are growing very fast, some are not growing very fast. Small and medium towns, some of them get linked with the national market, their growth gets stabilized. Some which do not get linked with the national market, their growth is very, very low. That's why the instability of the growth in class 2, class 3, class 4 categories is much higher compared to class 1 category. But certainly, I take your challenge and sit with you.
But isn't there a contradiction? You said that on one hand, the large cities are unable to attract migrants. On the other hand, you find concentration population in class 1, which has been increasing. How do you explain that?
You see, I must tell you that up to 2001, the growth pattern was very clear, that the class 1 cities were growing very rapidly. At least there is a... Sorry. I said that if you look at the data, I have myself written that the class 1 cities are growing very rapidly and million plus cities were also having slightly higher edge. But the pattern has changed during 2001, 2011. 2001, 2011, you do find class 1 cities growth rate is not higher than the class 2 towns. And million plus cities specifically, their growth rate has declined. The Delhi, Mumbai, as I said, you take the 25 largest cities, excepting Bangalore. And Bangalore, my God, I was there last week only. It has expanded beyond limits. I was traveling from airport to the electronic city. It took more time for me to travel there than from Delhi to Bangalore. It took 3.5 hours. That was the peak time. It's basically the aerial expansion which has taken place in Bangalore. Otherwise, population growth rate would have been much less. So I'm simply saying that the large cities, you look at the composition of migrants, no longer poverty-driven migrants which were coming earlier. Look at the 71, 81 data. You do find that large percentage of the migrants were poor. Now the cities are, are in a way unwelcoming to the poorest. Even for a domestic help in Delhi, we have to get it through an agency, and that person who is getting the job has to give 1 month's salary. The person who is employing has to give 1 month's salary, with a huge difference between rural and urban areas. Why can't we facilitate that? I'm not saying that rural people should come and start working as a domestic help, but at least there is some income generation which is taking place in the name of environment, in the name of health and hygiene, in the name of law and order problem. We want to, slow down the migration at the lower level. And that certainly affects the inclusive character. I know inclusiveness hits at the interest of the middle class. You want clean neighborhood. So your resident welfare association fights whenever there is a slum colony coming up. But I have a feeling that the major challenge would be to find employment for 410 million people who would be asking for jobs by 2050. How do you absorb them, these 410 million people who would have to be taken out of agriculture and be absorbed in small and medium towns, within the rural areas through sectoral diversification, or in the large cities by making the large cities inclusive. This is the real question that we have, and you cannot have this kind of an urbanization which will create political instability. Think about the increasing rural-urban inequality, not only in income terms, but also in terms of education and health facilities. The gaps are serious. Duke University, you might know Krishna, has come out with an interesting paper. He says he surveyed something like 18,000 students who have got job in prestigious institutions like School of Planning and Architecture, IIM, IITs, 18,000 students, and asked them the question, what is your background? Where did you have your education? Is it in a rural areas or a small towns? And what is your caste background? Of course, the caste and religious differentiation is there. But the major conclusion is that if you had your entire education up to higher secondary in a rural area, the possibility that you'll make it to this institution is almost zero. Those who have made it have at least for last 2 years have studied in an urban center. So we have to really bridge this gap if you want to have some kind of a stable political stability. I mean, I make future projections for 4 things, but I didn't talk about political scenario because that is very risky. It is risky because political parameters keep changing, and it's also not my area of my research. But nonetheless, I do believe that employment generation and a balanced urbanization, absorbing 510 million people away from rural areas into some productive employment, should be a major issue for our plans.
Good evening, Anne Veenstra, Dean of Architecture. You've talked a lot about cities, and I share the concern about 410 million jobs. Could you say something about the other end, what's happening in villages? Because you see in many places in India where you actually start to get ghost towns, small villages that actually become empty, people that go away, and then you have just a few people living and many, many empty houses. Do you also look at that aspect, or do you focus more on the urban aspect?
I must say that I do much of my research based on secondary data, right? And what I did is to take the villages into different population categories. Villages with less than 200 population, there are a large number of them, particularly in the hill areas. Villages with less than 1,000, 1,000 to 2,000. And Kerala has a large, even Tamil Nadu has a large number of villages with more than 10,000 population. What you are asking is, what would be the growth rate across different size class of villages? Yes, there are some villages which have become, particularly in the hill areas. This is not a phenomena which we have observed in the plains. In the hill areas, in Himachal, in Uttarakhand, there are villages where people are migrating out, because there is no employment possibilities. And, well, what do you do? One way would be to say, no, you have to maintain culture, ecology, you have to stay there and, make investment in providing infrastructure. But when you talk to the policymakers, they say it is so expensive to provide even the minimum level of amenities to that area, and what to talk about bringing them into mainstream and getting their children into IIMs and IITs and SPS. It's very expensive. So to some extent, restructuring of settlements would have to take place, but it has to be ensured that it doesn't happen at the cost of the rural population, their culture, their values, their norms. But I have a feeling that the government is going very slow on this restructuring. They are not really saying that these villages will be declared non-inhabitable. That's not happening. But in the plains, this phenomena certainly doesn't appear as very important. But the villages which have population more than 10,000, they somehow tend to stagnate. Many of them, unless they become urban, they don't get infrastructural support, they tend to stagnate. And that's why I was suggesting that under this Shyama Prasad Mukherjee Rurban program, they have identified 300 clusters. Clusters would mean something like 10, 12 villages together, and the infrastructure, one will have a hospital, other will have a college, so that all the 10 villages together and with a good connectivity can provide a viable economic base. And that is the model, and I have a feeling that if they pursue it seriously, this can stabilize rural population and also provide meaningful employment.
Is it on? Is it on? Okay. My name is Sanjay Prakash. I'm a visiting faculty member here. And I was very intrigued by the positiveness, in a sense, of your dispersed urbanization outlook. So there are two sub-questions. One is, do you really expect this to continue in the census that we will be having now in 6 years? That's a speculation, of course. And you may choose to say, I decline to answer that. But the other is the political will that you mentioned. Now, it's not just the S.P. Mukherjee urban kind of thinking that we can piggyback on. It's not just the Make in India which can be married to this kind of urban thinking. It could also be a variety of other initiatives that are already beginning to happen. For example, dispersed energy, coming from your third provocation, and dispersed urbanization go hand in hand. Dispersed water systems go hand in hand. So is this a time for the intelligentsia to start making a pitch for this kind of, should we say, a better urbanization with the current government?
I think you were right in mentioning that I have been perhaps very optimistic about the government doing things with a strong political will in the right direction. I am, because I don't have any other option. I mean, I don't belong to the agitationist mode. You know, I don't go out to the streets. I remember once I was attending a meeting with Aruna Roy and Medha Patkar. I'm telling you frankly, it was in Bombay, and suddenly somebody stood up and started shouting, saying that, Kanun todo aage bado, Kanun todo aage bado. And she also stood up. There was something like 4,000 people. I was on the dais. And she said that. And obviously she looked at me. She found me a little bit uncomfortable. So she said, please quiet. Professor Kundu, do you want to say something on this? I said, look, this was on slums in the urban areas. I said, I have my sympathies with you. But you know, when a middle class or an upper class person does not pay the electricity bills, there will be people coming and trying to disconnect, but there will be agitation. Newspaper fellows will write. Mr. Kejriwal himself will go and, restore the connection. You know, there is a strong political will. Can you imagine in Delhi, all the parties said water should be subsidized, electricity should be subsidized for the people of Delhi, whose average income is 3.5 times the national per capita income. I said that on the television before the election. I said, not a single party has said this is obscene. I mean, you can say just this targeted section. But my wife, who works in NIUS, she said, one of her colleagues said, this is a good subsidy because I consume less than that water. So it's many of the middle class people are getting water subsidy. Electricity subsidy is available to everyone. And you know, you can ask the middle class to give up your LPG subsidy. Once it will work. And I'm happy that it has worked once. But if the massive housing subsidy of 2.3 lakh is going to the middle class, no matter how loudly the Prime Minister or the President appeals, they will not return back this subsidy. So that's why on the housing sector, I say that this massive subsidy should not be given. Sorry, what was your question? I got it. Yeah, I'm hopeful because I was asked again, I'm getting derailed. You know, somebody asked me that this post-Sachar commission, are you hopeful that the government will implement some of the programs for the Muslims, some of the programs, for the education, health, and Also, we have talked about a sense of insecurity which exists there. I have a feeling that the statement of development being promoted is welcome. And the large section of the middle class in India welcomed this statement about development. But there are uncertainties, sense of insecurity, which we have talked about. When they asked me, do you think they will do it? I said, look, I've been promised by the minister, two of the ministers, Mr. Nazma Hepatullah and Naqvi, that we are looking into it. In the parliament, they have mentioned this, so I'm hoping. But tell me, has the opposition taken it up? Has the opposition raised that post-Sachar committee should be debated? This is the political convenience. They want to keep quiet. Even the left Marxist parties are not saying that, yes, this is a report which has to be taken up. Why blame the government? It's the whole political ethos of the country. So I personally think that the government should be able to restructure, and if they are serious about making India and linking up with the clusters, which the Secretary in the Ministry of Rural Development said, that we would like to promote a dispersed industrialization, and the large cities, in any case, the elites would not allow the big industries to come in. Look at the 27 big cities, you find percentage of manufacturing has gone down. Because we do not, the environmental concern in the large cities do not allow any of the pollutant industries to come in. This has become more residential, shopping malls, educational institutions coming up, health. So manufacturing has to go out, and there is a national market. You can create that kind of a manufacturing unit in the clusters, 300 clusters to be identified. All that we can do, since I'm into research, is to shout loudly. Take any opportunity, write research papers, grab, if some television fellow is asking me to come for 10 minutes and say that, I said that. The government's program of this housing for all has great risk of the subsidies going to the wrong hands. And that subsidies will never come back to the government's kitty once you have given them. So certainly we can always take a positive view and try give constructive criticism for the government. I hope you don't mind this optimism. एक सवाल ये भी है इसको लेकर
Subhranshu, for this, yes,
Hello.
one. Oh, now the hands are going up. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Well, sir, this is I'm Subhranshu from Faculty of Planning. I'm basically trying to ask you a question which we, as a fraternity of Faculty of Planning, face this question probably from our students quite often. And therefore, I'm asking this question probably on behalf of our students. See, more than 95% of the people in this room are planner or going to be urban planner in another 6 months' time. So the question here is, with the all kind of probable projections that you made, what are the kind of challenges or rather opportunities that our urban planners are going to face, and what kind of role do you expect them to play really in the coming future of cities?
We can take all the questions together. Here.
Rajesh bhai, I thought you will ask a question before leaving, no?
Hello sir, I'm Yash, student of urban planning. My question to you is that the migrants from rural to urban, it's very uncertain for them because they don't know if they'll get work or livelihood, because it's by chance. It's like I may not get. So how can we really make it certain or try and attempt by information or information aside, like to provide certain kind of maybe a platform, so some kind of information they could get in terms of where are the jobs available, or is it really viable or economical for me to migrate to a city? That's my question.
Sir, I'm Suhani from planning, of course. So my question is, one of the data said that 94% of our workforce is in the informal sector. Now, when we talk about migration from rural to urban areas, we say that we have to create job opportunities into and dispersed urbanization so that gets translated there. They bear the part of it. But why don't we create the educational, health or other facilities that empowers the rural population to get translated into the formal economy, which is easy for the cities, rather than getting them translated into the informal economy? So that is my question.
So you're saying that the education and health can be provided to the rural areas.
Good evening, sir. Sir, my name is Vibhor from Masters in Urban Planning second year. So my query is related with urbanization. That according to census, if we consider Indian census as a most authentic source, which says that 5,000 should be the population, which describes the density and other parameters. So considering these parameters, we describe the urbanization of India. So suppose I am comparing other global countries like Japan, China. So what are the challenges that we face? Like, because these countries have different parameters to define their urbanization, and we as India, we have different parameters to define urbanization. So this may lead to a mismatch. So I want you to comment on that.
Question, yeah. We need to end at 8 o'clock.
Hello, sir. I am from planning, undergraduate student. My question is particularly, we here are talking about urbanization and decentralized, creating more job opportunities and all these things. But I want to know what is then going to be the condition of the rural areas. Like at present, majority of the people are into agriculture and they are practicing it. And still we have food prices, they are rising, and we have so much of problem right now. And when all this gets translated into service sector and other manufacturing industry, what is going to be the result of it? The agriculture sector, and talking about especially mechanization, which I don't think is that much possible in India, because here the land is more into fragmented form. And again, going for a mechanization, there are lots and lots of problem, because the farmer doesn't want to give his land. He can give for development, but to other farmer, he's not ready. So there are many such problems. So what is your call on it?
There's one boy, last one.
I just wanted to ask, with you said that the tier 1 cities are basically becoming exclusionary, and hence this dispersed form of urbanization should be followed. But then how do the tier 1 cities actually link with this dispersed form? I mean, are they still to sort of invite global capital and follow the same path that they are following right now, or how will they link with this form, I mean, that you're proposing?
Thank you. You see, one thing that is very clear to me as far as the role and responsibilities of the planners in the next 10 years is that there is a lot of emphasis on private-public partnership, right? In smart cities, they're talking about PPP model coming in. We had a seminar 2 weeks ago. Pranab Sen comes and says that any big company in Europe that you can think of is bidding for coming into smart city project, right? Also under Amrit, there's a lot of public-private partnership models coming up. If you look at KPMG's report, which says that 3 trillion rupees is coming into the housing sector, house designing and all that together, I mean, settlement designing included. But this will be only 20% of the total money. 80% money, that means 4 times the money that the government is putting in, 4 times will come from the private sector. Now, the private sector, of course, would employ a large number of planners in the designing of the construction. But I mean, while Venkaiah Naidu always talks about PPP model, and I was impressed on 25th of June, our Prime Minister, when he referred to Amrit and Smart City project to 25th June 2015, he said, we cannot trust the private developers because they may not take care of the environmental concerns and the concerns of equity. I was very impressed. I don't know how many of you heard him. He never, even one sentence he said about high technology. He did not talk about, you know, global companies coming in and Europe and America will take this. Nothing. He talked about water, electricity, sanitation. Right? So I was very impressed. He also said that the planners will have to provide the institutional structure for the functioning of the private sector. Otherwise, our cities will be unmanageable, environmental issues and the equity issues will not be addressed. Again, I mean, I can't read his Man Ki Baat unless I can only listen to that. But certainly, I mean, that's a vision which I immediately appreciated, and I wrote, yes, focus should be on water, sanitation, electricity and housing for all, which is very much there as a part of the global agenda. You know, who was it? President Johnson or somebody, he said, somebody asked in a conference that, would you do this? President said, madam, would you make me do this? You know, that's important for us. We have to, all that we can do, we don't take stones in our hands and start throwing. At least I don't, but I would use every platform to tell the government that you are going in a different direction than what is desirable and what has been promised at the highest level. Now, as far as this different parameters are concerned for measuring urbanization, I would like to tell you that at the global level, when you compare on any indicator across the countries, you have the same problem. Informal sector is defined within India very differently. You know, the labor situation in Kerala will be very different from Arunachal Pradesh. What is a kacha house in Maharashtra is different from what is a kacha house in Assam. And we do have some standardization of the definition. International Conference of Labor Statisticians define what is employment, what is unemployment, and there is some kind of a general consensus. On poverty, they have taken $1, 1.25, they have revised it, 1.90, latest is $1 has been refined to 1.90, and get some kind of a comparable data across the countries. But again, it's not strictly comparable. That's why urbanization data also has problems of comparability across the countries. But as I mentioned, if you look at World Urbanization Prospect, there are full description of the definitions followed by different countries and how it has changed over time. I analyzed it, and as I said, roughly I gave you the figure that 55% of the countries or 60% of the countries have more stringent definition than India, but 40% of the less stringent definition than India. 40% of the countries have more stringent definition of urban centers. You have to live with such problems that we have. Now, how do you ensure livelihood to the people that are coming up in the urban areas? You know, I have a feeling that employment generation is not directly tackled by the government program, excepting the rural employment guarantee program. Urban employment largely would have to be through the market. The state has to make the cities much more amenable by providing basic infrastructural facilities. In South African constitution, there is not only right to food, there is also right to land. And they also create some spaces around the cities where people can come and settle down. We may not be able to do that, but certainly if the small and medium towns have little more of infrastructural support, I think their absorption capacity of the poor migrants will go up. They would be in a position to also attract some private sector investment, provided the government creates this in these clusters, the basic minimum infrastructural facility. And why I'm a bit hopeful, because even without those facilities, you do find many of the villages have been able to attract non-agricultural employment. I told you 2,800 new towns have been identified basically because they have attracted non-agricultural employment. With some government support through the clusters approach and the government's insistence that production base has to shift to India and the large cities becoming exclusionary. I have always thought that yes, if the large cities take people, many people say that yes, large cities should have more people, but what we find, they are not taking. Large cities have become exclusionary on their own. Bigger cities are not really having that massive migration which they used to take in the 60s and the 70s. If this is a part of reality, you have no other option but to provide the infrastructural base, shift that to small and medium towns, and also make these village clusters economically viable by providing minimum infrastructural facilities. I think I have not been able to answer all the questions. I will leave my email address. If you have any questions that you think you would like to ask me, I would certainly be happy to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kundu. Thank you very much for agreeing to come one day early and spend half a day with us at CEPT. Thank you so much, and we look forward to these opportunities again and again.